Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Network 2020's discussion about the role of big tech in foreign affairs. This is the first in a series of events, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later on. My name is Courtney Doggart. I'm the president of Network 2020. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, just a few words about Network 2020. We are an inclusive international community, and we're really focused on highlighting and driving innovative solutions to challenges in international affairs. We run a number of programs, such as this one, our virtual briefing series, which is free and open to everyone around the world. And we do a number of other discussions, private member-only discussions. We do deep dives. We're also doing our own qualitative research programs, and I'll actually be explaining a little bit about this later because Brian and I will be taking off for Tunisia tomorrow as part of that. So we'll be trying to post about our travels and the meetings that we're having online and social media. So please do follow us if you're interested in hearing about what we're doing there. We named this briefing a bit tongue-in-cheek as "Will Big Tech Take Over the Role of Nation State?" And in many ways, I know that idea seems a bit preposterous, yet any student of history also knows how power shifts and that our understanding of rule by nation states is still a relatively recent phenomenon. And so the combination of the power of big tech companies with technological advances means that we're really contending with forces that we don't yet entirely understand. And so in this series that we're doing right now on big tech and foreign affairs, we're really trying to dig into what some of those different pieces are. And today we're really looking at big tech, we're looking at technology and the role of companies. And we're very fortunate to have two incredible people who can help us make sense of these in the first of this series. So I'm very pleased to introduce first Kevin Allison. He's Vice President for Europe and Eurasia and Technology Policy at Albert Stonebridge. He was previously until recently at Eurasia Group and is very well versed in everything related to technology and policy. And I'm also very pleased to present Nazli Shukri, and she is a professor of political science and senior faculty at the Center for International Studies at MIT. And she is known for work on cyberpolitics and the concept of lateral pressure. So both of them, I think, will have a lot of interesting insights to help us understand a very sort of Wild West of this new world that we're in. So thank you both for being here. Welcome. Kevin, I'm going to start off with you, and I'm going to start with referencing an article in the November-December 2021 issue of Foreign Affairs that Ian Bremmer wrote, and you worked with Ian at the Eurasia Group until recently. And he writes, "The aftermath of the January 6th riot serves as the latest proof that Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Twitter are no longer merely large companies. They have taken control of aspects of society, the economy, and national security that were long the exclusive preserve of the state." So can you start us off? And I usually like to start off with a kind of common understanding of vocabulary and particularly in a topic where things are so new. Can you just give us some definitions and explain how these new non-state actors are increasingly shaping geopolitics, especially in contrast with history? And how may we view these technology companies as similar to states on the international stage?
Great question, Courtney, and thanks for the warm welcome. It's great to be on this esteemed panel and helping with Network 2020, understanding this really important topic. I think that the place to start, in Ian's article, the quote you read, he said it's just the latest evidence that companies are taking on a new kind of role in geopolitics. And I think that's important. If you think back to the Arab Spring, you mentioned you're traveling to Tunisia. You think back to the Arab Spring, there was a lot of reporting at the time about the role of social media companies and platforms in the Arab Spring and helping people organize, in helping to kind of spread the kind of Arab Spring movement around the world. So this is not necessarily a new phenomenon. I do think, however, over the decades since the Arab Spring, that the global situation has changed a lot. I think it's changed in a few different ways. there's this saying that more is different. And we've got just the sheer amount of data, the sheer amount of computing power that's available across the world, even since 2009 has changed a lot. The tech companies that provide the resources that people need to access that data, to create that data, to process and understand that data, are just playing such a bigger and bigger role across the entire global economy. The role of digital issues in the global economy has expanded massively. Technology has also become a subject of competition between countries in a way that it really wasn't before. And I'm speaking specifically around digital technologies. So since 2016, I think you've had this issue bubbling up of the way that countries like the US and China compete increasingly as strategic competitors in geopolitics, with technology really at the center of a lot of discussions of US-China competition. The European Union's also been moving to define and refine its digital regulatory playbook, partly because it's concerned that it's missing out on this digital revolution. It has not given rise to the same sorts of extremely large, hyperscale, you might say, technology companies that operate in the US and China and are really driving a lot of the agenda around AI, the Internet of Things, cloud computing, more recently edge computing, these new technologies that I think we're just on the cusp. And then finally, you have transitions underway in infrastructure. I remember when I first encountered the company Facebook when I was a correspondent in Silicon Valley for the Financial Times. And it was at the time when there were still questions swirling about whether Mark Zuckerberg had made a mistake by not selling to Yahoo. Would Facebook ever overtake MySpace? And at that time, it was sort of just after the launch of the first iPhone, which launched in the midst of the transition to 3G networks. You had the 4G network transition. And now we're in the midst of this transition to 5G networks, which I think we've still only really scratched the surface of what the 5G transition might be capable of in terms of the new types of internet-enabled applications and businesses that will be built on top of this new type of 5G infrastructure. So we're really at a kind of pivotal moment where you've got exponential increases in the amount of data. You've got geopolitics changing in the background, in part because of these technologies, or at least concern about these technologies. And meanwhile, you've got these companies that have, in 1997, for example, when Amazon was still just an online bookstore, the top 5 companies in the world by market cap were a cross section of industrial America. You had the Coca-Cola company, you had GE, you had pharmaceutical companies, you had one technology company. Microsoft. Today, the top 5 by market cap, recent stock market fluctuations notwithstanding, the top 5 companies by market capitalization in the world generally are sort of large internet platform companies. And I think it's a sign that they are increasingly playing a central role in the global economy. But as you say, they are also increasingly managing the infrastructure that many other businesses will rely on and governments will rely on to operate in the future. They're increasingly providing national security through providing cybersecurity. Certain companies of certain size playing a role in cyberspace that government can't really hope to play, almost providing that kind of public good in a way. And I think that one of the things that Ian was getting at in his article is that this is a new development in global affairs. You've had powerful companies in the past. You had the East India Company. You had big oil in the pre-OPEC days during its heyday. But that this time may be something different. And so I think that's an issue that we should unpick and explore, just to sort of set the stage for you.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Kevin. Nazli, turning to you, you've worked a lot on cyber politics. So could you explain a little bit about what you mean by cyber politics and how is it adapted to traditional international relations theories?
Well, thank you for the question. It's an important one. And I would turn it around just a little bit before giving you the answer, turning it around saying that I think that international relations theory has to adapt to cyber politics in a big way. It's really quite important, because if we stick to the old way of thinking about theory and thinking of the lenses that we use, we're going to be missing just about everything that has been discussed in the last few moments, and we can't afford to do that. So cyberpolitics is the conjunction of politics, which is arguments, debates, conflict, contentions over who gets what, when, and how within a certain framework. And that's a standard way of thinking about it in the field, as long as there's no use of force or violence, or once you have violence, you really don't have politics anymore. You have another thing. The cyber part is a domain that we've been talking about. But what is relevant, what makes it cyber politics, is the conjunction between the two. And now, particular examples we see is the use of cyber-related tools of the cyber domain to enhance, influence the kinetic or physical, traditional geopolitical, but also the use of the geopolitical and government tools to influence the cyber domain. So they're kind of interconnected. When we began to understand what cyberspace was about and moved to the cyber politics notion, we had a sense of parallel domains, cyber world, and then there's the world, the traditional world that we know, but it isn't the case anymore. Now they're really interconnected. Just a little point here about this issue of interconnection and the penetration in our lives. Usually I teach a course on cybersecurity along with other visitors, luminaries, etc. Usually start the course by asking the students, how many of you would be pleased to do without your iPhone or whatever phone that you're using for a month? No takers. Well, for about 2 weeks, no takers. All the way down to, how about for a day? Some few hands came up. So the point is really very obvious that unlike traditional technologies that were mentioned a moment ago, in this case, the technologies related to this particular domain penetrates down to the individual in society, almost as much, but I would say as much as the use of energy has. So I'm sorry for this long monologue, but that's where we are.
Thank you. That's very helpful and very true for anyone who's had to turn their phone into a shop for a day. It's very disorienting. Kevin, I'd like to turn a little bit to the idea, following up on what Nazli was saying about how interconnected these realms are now, and looking a little bit at regulation. And so regulation traditionally always lags new technologies. How siloed is technology and policy in our modern age compared to the advent of these innovations 10, 20, 30 years ago? So what do you see happening in the regulatory realm?
Well, I think we're living through, again, an interesting transition where if you think back to the early days of, well, certainly the internet as the sort of project that emerged out of DARPA and academic circles, connecting computers together, and then they had this evolution to the web in the early 1990s and so on. I think we're moving from an era in which the idea of tech regulation, certainly in the United States, where we're all sitting, there was an idea of less regulation being a bit better. Governments should generally stay hands-off. The internet multi-stakeholder model has been very successful. Data wants to be free. The very famous essay written in 1996 by John Perry Barlow, who hung out with the Grateful Dead and also was a sort of early internet scholar. I think we're moving from that era where there were, even in those early days in the 90s, a few exceptions to that mantra, notably in China, where information did not want to be free. We're now moving to an era where governments are recognizing that the way that digital technologies have evolved, the way that as Professor Chukri said, that access to information is going down to the level of the individual in society is creating some potential side effects. Side effects including cybersecurity vulnerabilities, side effects including vulnerability to manipulation, in terms of social media, where we've seen these trends play out. And so you are seeing regulators, not just in the United States, but around the world, certainly in the European Union and in their own way in China and in many other countries around the world, both emerging markets and more developed countries taking an interest in regulating this digital sphere. I think that the challenge is it's extremely difficult. And this goes back again to why could this time be different? We've had powerful companies in the past. Energy companies were essential to making modern society work. They've been regulated. Well, I think one of the big differences is that digital companies are creating these new digital spaces that are kind of an entirely new development in geopolitics. The East India Company, Exxon, other energy companies were operating exclusively in physical space. The big tech companies, they do operate in physical space. The servers sit in a physical location somewhere. The executives are sitting somewhere. They can be arrested, they can be taxed, they can be fined. But they are also creating these new digital spaces where many millions of people around the world, or even billions of people, are increasingly spending time and having basic needs met. And I think that as the growth of that digital space has become exponential, and it's hard even for the companies themselves to understand and control what happens in that space, that you just have this very large governance challenge. And what you're seeing is regulatory systems that were not created to manage digital problems having to evolve. And it's no secret regulation lags behind. I think we're in a very interesting moment where governments understand the need to regulate differently, but they lack maybe the tools, they lack the personnel, they lack the structures for doing so. And I think the next decade will be very interesting as that regulatory system is built out around the world.
Thank you. Just kind of jumping off on that, Nazli, you co-authored the theory of lateral pressure, which suggests that individuals and societies tend to expand and exert influence beyond their established boundaries. Would you mind jumping off on that question as well? Any thoughts you have in light of that theory, or any response to Kevin?
Well, just let me start with a quick, not a response to Kevin, but a footnote on his very last point, which all of his points were really very, very helpful. But the very last one about the government and regulation, there is the hidden players in all of this. I mean, they're observable, but we don't analyze them very well. And that is the lobbyists that are pushing, for the whatever interests, whatever companies wish to pursue. So it's getting. We have to remember that in the governance domain, there are those players, and they're not very interesting to all of us, to any one of us, but they do exert influence. And I was wondering what Kevin's reaction would be to whether he thinks this makes sense, or whether I'm overstressing the role of lobbyists. And then I'll get your question.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that one of the issues that it's an issue that's tackled across many domains of the global economy, not just the technology sphere, right. But in many other areas where governments and the private sector kind of encounter one another is if you look at the complexity of some of this regulation, or the complexity of how you actually go about trying to understand a problem, much less regulate it. I think that companies and business associations and so on, they play an important role in this, in the sense that even if you look at the EU, which tends to be much more skeptical of US technology players operating in its economy, even the EU, when undertaking something like its code of practice around disinformation, which it rolled out a few years ago in response to some of the political pressure around doing a better job of managing disinformation, I think governments almost universally across the world recognize that without input from industry, they'll have a hard time developing effective regulatory structures. And in some cases, again, even in Europe, self-regulation by industry or working in public or private partnership with industry may be a more effective approach than sort of top-down regulation. I think because of the way that these digital spaces are very complex. If you think about the array of cloud computing, access to compute power, dissecting and looking at how companies develop individual algorithms, it is such an immense kind of complex ball of issues that governments need to get on top of. There is certainly, I think, a productive role that companies and business associations can play. It doesn't mean that governments should take their input uncritically, and it doesn't mean that governments shouldn't, try to have good governance. But I do think it is very much a domain in which there needs to be an effective public and private sector partnership, as well as other parts of civil society, to try to get around addressing some of the negatives and accentuating the positives of digital development.
So if it's, let me now answer the question. Lateral pressure is about, it overlaps almost entirely with other theories and the realities that we're seeing, but it has some assumptions that are really quite relevant to this discussion, having to do with the systems in which individuals and states operate in. We actually are embedded in geopolitical, but we're also embedded in the cyber domain, and we haven't talked about being embedded in the natural environment, climate change, etc. Being embedded is one part of it, but the second part is that we don't have the option of opting out. Sorry, I want to be out of the natural environment. Doesn't exist. But having said that, it also views the individual. This is not a lecture, just the individual view, me, etc., as having two important functions that features that carry through society, and depending on how the state manages this or encourages, we get propensities for expansion or not. And the two functions of the two features are: we all consume energy and we are all information processing. But countries differ on their capabilities, on their way of managing the resources that they have, etc. And they also differ on their objectives. The tendency to kind of improve their conditions is something that we've observed, and in so doing, they expand their behavior to trade or to do whatever. The politics of this and the geopolitics of this is other countries are doing exactly the same thing. And this is where potential conflicts of interests come up. And we're now in the middle of an experiment. We're observing one country, let me say Russia, expanding physically its interest next door. One of the points that I'd like to highlight in the case of states, countries, when all is said and done, countries differ with respect to their population, we know that, with respect to the resources they have, and with respect to technology. And the various combinations kind of shape the priorities that countries have in trying to improve their conditions. The puzzle I have in relation to this is, why are we trying to improve our conditions? Why do we want to blah, 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 blah? I don't know of a single case in which countries have said, look, we have resource needs, but we've learned to live without those resources, and there's no reason for us to make an effort. Or technology development is somebody else's business, eventually we'll do our own. Yeah? This is not part of it. So we are assuming, I'm assuming that the movement towards improvement, towards more, etc., is part of the dynamics that we're talking about. Very much along the lines of power in traditional international relations thinking.
Thank you. Just kind of related to that. My next question, Kevin, I'll turn to this to you for this one first, is, we're really looking at the struggle for influence, or maybe it shouldn't be struggle, but maybe there's another word, between technology firms and governments, and sort of how that's playing out. But when you look at that framework based on what Nazli was just saying about how it plays out differently in different countries, how does that shape the future of this regulation? I mean, on the one hand, you have countries like, the US and China, which are leaders in technology, Europe lagging, but Europe's really a leader in kind of setting the bar in policy. So how does that work on a global scale when there's this back and forth and jockeying for position? Do we all need to head in the same direction? Or if countries make different decisions, how does that influence the playing field?
Well, I think that the very clear trend that we've seen emerging over the past 5-6 years, starting with lots of speculation about, as the US and China technology competition had started to heat up in 2016. You had the Trump administration come in 2017 and institute tariffs against China, pursuing this strategy. Really, again, it was trade policy, but very much aimed at technology, trying to put pressure on China and even specific Chinese companies, technology companies like Huawei. You had this trend of everyone asking whether we're heading for a kind of fragmentation or bifurcation of technology between a US or Silicon Valley centric technology stack and a Chinese one. I think that the discussion over the past couple of years has changed a little bit. You're now having a discussion about, I've used the term, whether there could be some kind of digital realignment. So rather than a massive fragmentation of the internet or splinternet, whether you might get large blocks of countries, like-minded countries, acting together around common policies, or at least interoperable policies. And I think that you've seen this in these sort of nascent, but nonetheless interesting technology alliance discussions that have been pushed out by the United States and Europe, between the US and the countries involved in the quadrilateral security dialogue. So that's the US, India, Japan, Australia. I think you've seen a realization that if we are living through this much more political era of digital technology, in which governments are trying to control one another's access to advanced technologies, they see technology as a source of both economic competitiveness and potentially military competitiveness in the future. Can you move from having something very fragmented, where data can't really easily flow between the US and the EU because of data privacy concerns, or India may be instituting data localization provisions, and Brazil taking its own unique approach on data, China taking its own unique approach? Can there instead be more of an alignment between different countries? It's an extremely important question. I think it will take a lot of slow, methodical, plodding diplomacy to answer that question. But we've just been following, for example, the meetings last week of the US and EU Trade and Technology Council, which is one of the more advanced of the efforts that's been set up to try to hash out some of these issues. And it's important to understand it's not just around things like social media and disinformation. It's around a much more complicated spectrum of issues, ranging from the supply chains for semiconductors and minerals that will be very important for electric vehicles and other types of high-tech gadgets, things like rare earth magnets and lithium, to the disinformation issues, to other issues, around industrial policy. It's really hard to understand this change. We talk a lot about technology disrupting geopolitics, but as that disruption happens, political decisions also about how to regulate and whether or not the US, EU, India, other countries will see eye to eye on policy also have a huge impact on the way that technology itself will develop. It's very much a feedback loop. So I do think that question of can there be better alignment going forward? Can there be ways, if it's not one happy global internet, is there a way to have as big a kind of total addressable market as possible for companies to be able to, whether you're a large company or a small business, and whether you're sitting in Silicon Valley or Europe or Brazil or Sub-Saharan Africa, to be able to design products and services that can have as big of a total addressable market as possible. I think is the sort of big open question that both policy and business has to grapple with.
Thank you for that. And we had a conversation a while back, I think sometime last year, with Richard Fontaine about the similar concept about the alliance of techno-democracies. And so, Brian, I don't know if you're able to find that and put that in the chat. That might be of interest to people as well. One final question I'll try to get in before I turn to the Q&A box. And so, Nazli, kind of a similar question for you, but with a slight twist. In the book, International Relations in the Cyber Age, that you co-authored with David Clark, you write about how digital interactions have enabled weaker actors to influence or threaten stronger actors, including traditional state powers. So how do you see that particular dynamic playing out in the realm of international relations?
Well, the internet, cyber domain, etc., has allowed weaker actors, physically weaker actors, to voice in a way that they hadn't been able to do so before, and has also allowed them to reach out to each other, like-minded, perhaps in a way that we don't approve of, or like in a way that was not possible before. And it has also allowed them to access information, knowledge, etc., that they can then leverage, in their diplomacy in a way that they had not been able to do before. So my view of the international system as a whole, the global system, is there's a leveling of the playing fields, and not so much an equalizing, but something of a leveling that may have important implications for how the cyber domain in relation to the physical domain evolves. I'd like to just change the subject for a moment and raise or ask or comment on the likely implications of who produces chips and how fast, and who, in terms of companies, is chip deficit, as an example. And the reason I'm raising this is because we seem to see an interconnections at the technology level among the technology companies, or their physical location in different countries. And the question that we're left with is, will governments try to use whatever advantages that they might have with respect to their own companies in a geopolitical framework, or try to separate the market side from the geopolitical side? And the chip example is maybe one of my favorites, and it embedded in the supply chain concerns.
Thank you for that. I'll turn to the Q&A box now. Kevin, we have a question here, and the questioner is asking, does big tech play a proxy role similar to proxy wars between two rival nations? The US-China trade war as my example of this, such as the position of governments on the Huawei's 5G technology. So what are the implications of this sort of jostling? Is big tech a pawn in a proxy war?
That is an interesting question. I think I would hesitate to sort of put them into the category of being pawns in a proxy war. I do think it opens an interesting line of inquiry, which is how do you think about these tech companies as geopolitical actors? And do they have a lot of power, or are they actually really weak and subject to governments coming after them? I think that it's important to distinguish what motivates companies is in many ways different to what motivates a government or a nation state. Companies with their profit motives traditionally have been less aligned to the national objectives of governments. Now, you can argue that may be necessarily different for companies operating in China, for example, who may come under different forms of pressure from the Chinese government to at least adhere to its sort of big picture priorities. And I think you've seen a sort of willingness by China to engage in regulatory crackdowns or regulatory campaigns against its big tech companies in ways that, for example, the US has not done to date. From that perspective, you could view companies as, as being very much subject to the sort of whims or being enlisted in proxy struggles by governments, or at least subject to uncertainty or regulatory interventions because of the US-China technology conflict. But on the other hand, I think it's important not to discount the other side of it, which we mentioned before, which is that there are aspects of how these companies are creating these new digital domains where people are spending significant amounts of time that do give them control over, that give them real power. I mean, I think I was having a discussion about this with someone I know who was around at the very early days of one of the very large internet platforms, who said a lowly coder at one of these companies can make a change to the algorithm or a change to a product that has effects at global scale. You can literally, by changing the way that search results display or a news feed displays or something else displays on a platform with 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion users, that is a form of power that really hasn't been available to people previously. And so I think it would be a mistake to completely discount companies and say they're really nothing but pawns in proxy wars between countries. I think they, to some extent, have their own agency. I think what we're experiencing is that the way the technology is developed is kind of creating a new category of geopolitical actor that we maybe don't have a great framework or name for yet. And that people writing 2 or 3 decades from now will look back and clearly have named this trend or this phenomenon, and we'll have some kind of frame of reference for it. But I think we're kind of stuck in a position now where we're muddling through, and we don't fully understand either the scale and scope of the way that these digital technologies are changing our lives and political economy and geopolitics. And so, maybe a long way of saying, I don't have a neat potted answer to that question. I think it's very interesting.
Great, thank you. Nazli, we're getting a couple of questions on the idea of user data. So one question, I'm going to try to combine them, is whether the US and other countries could enact laws to specify opt-in for data sharing rather than it being the default and needing to opt out. And someone else brings up the potential for the data being monetized or being paid for our data. In ways that we currently don't have. What are your thoughts on how data is currently being used and how that affects the power of the tech companies and the power of the individual user?
Well, this is interesting because in the past, we really never thought of data as, we just thought of data, the monetizability of data, the connection to privacy and the rules about Europe's GDPR, and whether or not how we're going to manage sharing, who owns the data, who owns your own data. So it's almost like Pandora's box, and I don't have an answer to it other than that is opening a sphere that we're going to have to deal with. The monetization of it is the one that is likely to emerge faster, either the monetization or the control or whatever, than pushing more on the privacy. That's my sense of it now.
Anything you'd want to add, Kevin?
I would just say the interesting thing to watch, I think, obviously we've had since 2018 when it was adopted, the GDPR in Europe, putting a regulatory framework around personal data. The US still has not adopted a national digital privacy law, but many states are moving to do so. And the US also will regulate things like digital privacy through kind of backward-looking enforcement by agencies like the FTC, which have jurisdiction in certain cases. I think there's a couple of interesting things, not only, and it's the way that along with the policy that may evolve on data and personal data and who controls it and how you monetize it, there's also legal and technological innovation going on around personal data. Legal in the sense of people doing some interesting thinking on new legal structures, things like data trusts, which have been mentioned in policy documents in the EU and in some other places around a way for people to pool their personal data into a trust with a fiduciary whose responsibility would be to safeguard that data and responsibly monetize it, for example. But then also around these things that people are calling privacy enhancing technology, which allows, they might allow a company or some other player to keep data encrypted. So never decrypt or never really actually see the data, but still extract insight from it from doing machine learning on it, for example. This is a kind of new and developing field of technology. It's still largely at the pre-commercialization stage, but again, has been mentioned by policymakers in some countries as something that's of increasing interest as people look to balance this issue of whether it's sensitive personal data or some other kind of sensitive data, data from a machine in a factory where the company might not want to let other people or other companies or other players see that specific data for trade secret reasons, but might benefit from pooling it with some others to allow machine learning to take place on it, for example. So I think that watching the sort of policy, legal, and technological innovation around data and privacy is going to be very interesting over the next 5 years.
Can I just follow up on this at a different level? And that is, at the same time, we see individuals, people, population, making their own inputs. The success of what was Facebook before the adjustments, there's a lot of voluntary making available daily life, daily existence, etc. So it's not clear to me whether there's a stress in society as a whole between the privacy, concern about privacy, and on the other hand, a cultural change towards sharing, opening up, etc. Now, both are existing, but what's the net on that, and where might it be going? Far more important is the question of to what extent do countries differ between or among each other with respect to the behavior of individuals on making information available and the role of government in trying to control that or to push on privacy. So it's kind of a spaghetti plate that has to be sorted out too.
A good analogy. Our next question, I'd like to hear from both of you on it. I'll start with you, Kevin. The person asks, can you both speak to the question of digital tech companies' effect on the principle of state sovereignty? Is technology eroding the concept in a real palpable way, pointing towards some fundamental change in global governance? So Kevin, we'll start with you. Big question.
Yeah, that's a big one. Well, I think, as I said earlier, I think there is a plausible argument to be made that, especially as we move through the 5G network transition and starting to look towards 6G, with all of the services and applications that will be built on top, that you will have infrastructure that is primarily run by private companies, that is massively increasing the sort of data space, for lack of a better term, that operates a little bit differently to traditional physical space, and has really complex cybersecurity issues wrapped up in it, that you are seeing, at a minimum, no government standing by itself is going to be able to provide that infrastructure and cybersecurity for its own citizens. That's not necessarily new in global politics. We rely as a global economy tremendously on private sector energy companies to develop and deliver energy, which you could argue is still even more fundamental than semiconductors or cloud computing architecture to running a global economy. But I do think, to that extent, where governments themselves can't provide essential goods that people rely on to kind of thrive and build a global economy. Yes, you could argue that the companies maybe are eroding sovereignty in some way, or at least playing an outsized role. But then again, the other issue is digital space really different? And there, I think that there's again a plausible argument to be made that yes, it is a bit different. The governments because they can't feasibly regulate down to the level of individual lines of code, are going to have trouble exercising sovereignty over that space. And what does that mean? Well, you'll have actors operating in digital space operating outside of government's control. That's again, not necessarily a new phenomenon. The question is how that evolves over time as digital space massively expands and the entire global economy depends on it to a certain extent.
Let me follow up on this in a slightly different way. The analogy or the comparisons between sovereignty issues in the cyber domain, and I agree with everything that's been said so far, with sovereignty issues in the natural environment, whether it's global warming, climate, or whatever it is. The state really cannot control what crosses borders in terms of affluence and the like. But the point that I want to push to at least to raise is that this porousness of borders in those two domains may force governments to recognize that partnerships, cooperation, we can put some barriers in what crosses borders, but not very much. And in fact, we may all recognize that we are in a global transition at the moment, trying to figure out not so much eliminating sovereignty or eroding sovereignty, but how to manage the necessary interconnections between the firms, the natural environment, and the who has the authority to manage which domain. Or to put it differently, the job description of a government and a state is very different than the job description of a tech firm or any other firm, but they kind of need each other. And what the government and the state does is legitimize a course of action. What the firm wants, or company wants, is a course of action that is useful to it as well. So there's a back to politics and bargaining and negotiation. But the legal fact of sovereignty, I think is here to stay, at least for a while.
Good, thank you. We've talked a lot about the government realm and then sort of the big tech company realm. We have a question here where the questioner is interested in the panelists' comments on the brain drain that he perceives, where many potentially creative technologists are being seduced by the higher income they can earn by applying their skills in financial services, especially hedge funds, private equity, and overall investment banking. So there's another piece to this puzzle that is dynamic as well. Kevin, I see you smiling. Would you care to comment on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the idea that certain sectors that kind of become the it sector of the global economy at a given time can kind of disproportionately attract talent, not always for the most useful ends, is an interesting phenomenon. Finance was big in the 2000s as a sort of destination for the most promising graduates. You could argue that the other industries in the 2010s have also attracted talent that could be applied to solving really tough, more traditional engineering problems or climate change and so on. I think that this problem will persist, especially as if you think about the next phase of the internet revolution really being, a lot of people think, the industrial internet. And again, it's part of the 5G transition. We've had, the past decade was very much about personal data going online and becoming monetized for better or for worse. The next decade, the next part of this revolution that many companies and governments are trying to position for is that traditional industries, things like factories, which will move from being very analog to having millions of connected devices on a factory floor, kind of all humming and working together. Artificial intelligence and massive Internet of Things deployments kind of working together to optimize, really has the potential to transform almost every sector of traditional manufacturing. It has, AI also has potential to transform the service sector of the economy, a really much broader cross-section of industries will start to be affected by this digital transition in a way that they haven't necessarily to date, where it's been largely about business software, digitization, business processes. Here you're talking about digitization of physical processes. So I think that the need for talent is going to become much more acute. I think it's a huge opportunity for certain countries that maybe haven't had a chance to participate as much as they might have liked to in the digital revolution so far, to really focus on how they create the right conditions for that sort of talent to be nurtured and grown in their economy and to make them globally competitive. So I think that, yeah, point very well taken, that there is this brain drain effect, and it can be an issue for policymakers.
Can I turn the conversation around to two issues that we haven't really raised that just come out of what Kevin has just said, and they're very much alive in the research side of what we're trying to do at MIT. I'm sure other people, other places as well. First has to do with the issue of ethics. Are there any directives of where we can and cannot go, should or should not go, etc.? Now, ethics is not exactly central to geopolitics or to the operation of big tech, but it's impossible to kind of completely ignore that, because it will come out in different ways, and maybe even through the legal system. So that's one. The second is the future of AI. And this is an area where it's quite possible that the international community, this means mainly led by big tech, and governments may have to follow, because the governments be the agents of producing some kind of accord, some kind of mechanism about what the parameters ought to be or can be to facilitate the use of AI and its growth, but also to prevent deleterious or damaging directions of the use of AI. So in a way, I see the evolution of a global accord, general parameters of permissible behavior by the firms and by the governments in that area as being very important. I can see the contours of this, and it'll become more consolidated as we move along.
Thank you. Nazli, I'm going to stay with you for this. We have a couple of questions about the role of tech as a global power in developed countries versus less developed ones, and how will available infrastructure play a role. And so we have a couple of questions that are along those lines. So how do you see that playing out in more developed countries versus lesser developed?
And let me start with less developed countries, because there we've seen cases, pathways that say that they see their own development not necessarily as replicating the trajectory of the industrial countries, but as technologies are available now for leapfrogging. So don't need to pave all the roads, no need to, etc. More alternatives are viewed on the one hand. On the other hand, there are pressures that developing countries have on them that industrial countries didn't have at that time when they started to industrialize. The environmental issues, the equity issues, etc., etc. On the side of advanced countries, I think that they're pushing frontiers of maybe not so much global competition, but what their internal populations might be comfortable with or not. We haven't spoken much about the voter, the constituencies, etc. The voter may not matter very much in China, but we think the voter may matter in the United States. And if we connect this where we are now in the conversation with the issue of shortages of labor or shortages of skills, etc., then we really have a political issue brewing. And that's maybe as far as I want to take that.
Kevin, turning to you, we have an interesting question that makes me think of other things that you had said in the conversation about, how you understand a problem. And we've been kind of talking about big tech companies as this monolith. How do you look at it? And then the question in particular, this one is, how nuanced is the difference of political influence in information networks, such as Facebook, Google, and Twitter, that have become the infrastructure through which we understand the world, and frontier technologies or other massive companies with large investment and lobbying potential? So kind of taking this monolith, what are the differences between the different kinds of companies that are out there, and does that matter?
That is an interesting question. I think every company is different. I think some of the, speaking in general terms, large technology companies traditionally have been built and run by product and engineering people, and that thinking in very political terms or geopolitical terms is a learning curve for many companies. Sort of understanding that they're acting as geopolitical actors. I think you can look at the sort of full spectrum of technology companies in the Fortune 500 and say that some have maybe gone further down that road of sort of understanding how they operate politically, and some maybe have a little bit more ways to go. I wouldn't want to get into any individual companies, but I think that over the past couple decades in which these large, I'd say, digital tech firms, because there have been technology companies historically that have been very important over time, but certainly these digital platform companies have been really evolving the way that they look at some of these problems. I think it's getting more headspace and attention at the highest levels of these companies. I think that things like the history of where a company has come from is very important. In terms of how they'll approach this kind of problem. So there's a lot of variation, even amongst a smaller number of large companies that tend to be in the headlines. But I think at this point, it is absolutely clear that having political strategies, having an understanding of geopolitics and policy trends is essential for the future of these businesses in a way that maybe it hadn't been apparent even as recently as 10 years ago. So we have seen this big change. But I think it will continue to evolve. And again, I think one of the big challenges is, as it's not just the big high-tech companies, but also beverage makers and companies that make machine parts and companies that make other XYZ consumer or more sort of industrial technology, also will have to navigate these trends and cross currents and start to worry about things like data governance and AI ethics and other things in ways that they haven't before. It's going to take a big investment to do that. And I think it's going to be, creating new jobs for enterprising graduates of policy and political science programs for many years to come.
Well, that actually seems like a good place to end on, because we're almost at the hour. So new jobs and students and policy programs always seems like a great place for people like us to wrap the conversation. So thank you both so much for this. It's certainly a plate of spaghetti, as you put it, Nazla, and it seems like there's a lot of interesting things happening in this space, and I'm sure someone will look back on this conversation in 10, 20 years, and as you pointed out, Kevin, they'll have words and vocabulary for what we're going through now. So thank you both for joining us. Really quickly, this was the first in our Geopolitics of Technology series, so we're confirming other ones as we speak. We're hoping to do one on June 16th on the future of war. We're looking at propaganda and disinformation, and then also a new age of digital diplomacy. So please do watch our website. We'll be sending out announcements about the rest of this series. So thank you both for kicking us off. It really was a wonderful conversation. Our next event we have on Tuesday, June 14th, we're doing our foreign affairs discussion group, and we'll be leading groups and breakouts to figure out their own perspectives on Xi's gamble on Putin and was doubling down a mistake. So please do join us for that. They're a lot of fun. So thank you both. Thank you everyone who joined, and have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.